Imagine you are the brand new boss at a company, but none of the employees are following the rules.
No, God!
You gotta prove that you mean business. What do? You've gotta show them who's boss. Welcome to Learning with Sprayberry, where we make social studies fun, easy, most importantly, educational. Today's topic, the Whiskey Rebellion. But before we get into why we care, let's get into some background so you understand what's really going on. New country, new problems. The United States started off as a country the same way a college grad starts out, tired and broke. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, realized that all the states in our country are heavily in debt due to the Revolutionary War. His plan was to have the federal government absorb all the states' debts and turn it into one lump sum. He planned to offset some of the debt in two ways. One, he's going to apply tariffs, which are going to increase domestic spending, buying stuff from your own country, and the other was to place a tax on whiskey, which I get is ironic because, the war was fought over arbitrary taxes just slapped on us for no reason. Anyway, Washington was initially opposed to the tax, but spent part of 1791 going through a few states to see if the taxes would be justified. Many of the local officials he spoke with wholeheartedly agreed to the taxes. However, just like today, officials don't always know what the people actually want. Almost immediately after the tax goes into effect, protests began. The tax could be paid in two ways. Producers could pay the tax by the gallon, or they could pay a flat fee. Paying by the gallon averaged out to about 9 cents a gallon. For producers who produced much larger amounts, the flat fee could be a whole lot cheaper if you made more. Today, we don't think much about taxes except that we don't enjoy paying them. In the 1790s, it was even worse. The reason this matters is that in more rural areas of the country, whiskey was produced by farmers. Farmers that grew excess crops sometimes turned it into liquor. In many places in the U.S., whiskey was traded and bartered for like it was cash. People were kind of skittish around paper money being issued by a country that's barely old enough to cross the street. But whiskey is a cold, hard fact that you can trust and rely on. You might get paid for a day's work in whiskey, which you could then drink. Or you could trade for goods that you actually needed. The problem is, if you tax the whiskey made by small farmers, it hits the small farmers disproportionately hard. They aren't making huge quantities of whiskey like Eastern distilleries were. They're making small amounts, which means they're having to pay the gallon tax, which hits them with every gallon they make. As you might have guessed, this problem steps up to agitated protests. Well, violence, really. Tax collectors are threatened and ignored by producers. On September 11th of 1791, violence kicks off. Robert Johnson was out collecting taxes in Pennsylvania. He gets circled by 11 men who strip him naked, tar and feather him. As you can imagine, he resigned after this. Many people felt that if they simply refused to pay the tax, it's eventually going to go away. In some cases, people banded together to ensure that people refused the tax. One organization, the Mingo Creek Association, had a mob boss mentality and often threatened violence in order to keep people from paying the tax. Some people who paid the tax might have been, had an accident happen to their still or their barn. Accidents happen. Nobody can plan them. General John Neville was brought in to collect the tax. He was a planter and a landowner. Also, a large-scale whiskey producer. So naturally, he wasn't exactly well liked. His attempts to collect the tax were aided by federal government, who issued some 60 subpoenas for failure to pay. People who received the subpoena had to travel all the way to Philadelphia for court, costing them time and money as a farmer. Neville met with federal marshal David Lennox to help him find those who had to be served subpoenas. While on their way to the Miller farm, shots were fired at the two men. Lennox fled back to Pittsburgh, while Neville headed home. The next day, 30 members of the Mingo Creek Association surrounded Neville's home. They demanded that he surrender Lennox. Neville answered them in the form of a bullet that killed one of the Mingo Creek members. They then returned fire. By the third day, 600 people had come to aid the Mingo Creek Association, including their leader, James McFarland, a Revolutionary War veteran. After some negotiating, a ceasefire was ordered and McFarland began to approach the house. A shot came from somewhere, we're not sure where, killing him instantly. This action naturally riled up the Mingo Creek Association even more. They then decided to plan a march on Pittsburgh. Close to 7,000 people gathered, many who were simply poor farmers who felt this tax was an attack on the poor. The goal was to loot homes and burn the town to the ground in protest. When Washington, both the place and the man, heard about the incidents in Pennsylvania, a decision was made. Washington has a Supreme Court justice declare parts of Pennsylvania in a state of open rebellion. This grants him the power to use the military to restore order. Washington amassed a force of roughly 13,000 volunteers and drafted soldiers, and for the first and last time, the president directly leads forces into battle. Upon seeing the size of the army heading their way, the Mingo Creek Association runs away. But not before 2,000 of them were arrested. Many of those arrested were, eventually released due to a lack of witnesses and poor testimony. However, 24 are indicted with treason, but only 2 are convicted. The punishment for this is hanging. Washington instead chooses to pardon these 2 in an attempt to show the mercy that the federal government has. So what? The real importance of this event isn't that the people protested a tax. That happens all the time. It was the scale of these protests mixed with the government's response. This protest happens almost after the ratification of the Constitution, which places the power of the federal government as the highest power in the country. If Washington had chosen to allow the protest to continue or simply ignore the problem, people would have seen the federal government as weak and easy to ignore. Instead, Washington chooses to demonstrate the power and strength of the federal government so that people would believe in the government, and play ball. In the aftermath of the rebellion, people looked favorably on Washington's decision. People realized that the federal government was willing and able to enforce laws. The reality, however, is a little bit different. Even though the rebellion is squashed, it's still extremely difficult to collect taxes from small rural whiskey producers, leading many to simply continue refusing to pay. Once Thomas Jefferson and the Republican Party come into office in 1801, the whiskey tax is eventually repealed. Question of the day. The tax in question is passed by Congress, an elected body for the purpose of paying off debts that had created this country. Do you think the protesters have a leg to stand on in this conflict? Or are they completely off base in their response? Let me know down in the comments below. Let's head on over to YouTube to pull a subscriber of the week. This week, it's Grandpa Zan Survival. Thanks for watching. If you want to be featured as a subscriber of the week, you've got to be subscribed. You can follow me on Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. That's it for this week. And as always, thanks for watching Learning with Sprayberry, where we do our best to make social studies fun, easy, and educational. Thanks.